Machiavelli never believed loyalty was a virtue. He believed it was a transaction that most people were too sentimental to admit they were making. And that sentimental is exactly what gets used against you. You've lived the proof of this. The person you trusted completely, right up until trusting them completely became inconvenient for them. The alliance you assumed was built on mutual respect until you needed something from it and discovered it was only ever built on mutual convenience. The person was set. The loyalty you gave freely, without ever asking what it was actually resting on, until the moment it was tested, and there was nothing underneath it at all. Life, age, by the end of this, you'll understand why treating trust as earned rather than assumed isn't cynicism. It's the only version of trust that actually survives contact with real stakes. The word loyalty gets used constantly and examined rarely. Most people accept it the way they accept any word that sounds like a virtue, without asking what it's actually made of in a given relationship. Machiavelli's cold observation was that loyalty, in almost every case, is downstream of interest. People stay loyal while staying loyal serves them, and the loyalty dissolves at almost exactly the moment it stops. This isn't a flaw in human nature that better people rise above. It's the baseline mechanism, and pretending otherwise doesn't make you more trusting. It just makes you more exposed. The first principle is that unconditional trust is a gift you give people you haven't actually tested yet. This sounds harsh until you notice how it plays out in practice. Someone earns your trust through words, through declarations of loyalty, through promises of how they'll show up when it matters. Words are free to give and cost nothing to break. Trust built on words alone is trust built on the cheapest material available. And Machiavelli understood that anyone offering that material generously, before there's been any real cost to them, is offering you something that hasn't been tested yet. So the test only comes later, when trust actually costs the other person something. And that's the only moment that tells you what it was actually worth. The test is not that the only moment isn't. The second principle is that people reveal the real terms of their loyalty exactly once. At the moment, it becomes expensive to maintain. And most people miss because they're too invested in the version of the relationship they'd already decided was true. Watch what happens when loyalty gets tested by real stakes. Someone who claimed unconditional support suddenly discovers conditions. Someone who promised they'd never choose someone else over you discovers a scenario where they will. This isn't usually betrayal in the dramatic sense. The beast, it's just the actual terms surfacing. Terms that were always there, just never priced into the relationship, because nobody asked what would happen if it got expensive. Here's what's worth sitting with, because this is where the discipline actually lives. Recognizing that loyalty is conditional doesn't mean giving up on trust entirely, and it doesn't mean treating every relationship like a transaction to be defended against. Machiavelli wasn't arguing for isolation. He was arguing for accuracy. The strategist doesn't refuse to trust people. They refuse to trust people beyond what's actually been demonstrated, which is a completely different posture than suspicion. Suspicion assumes the worst before evidence. Strategic trust simply declines to assume the best before evidence either, and waits to see what the relationship actually does under pressure before deciding what it's worth. The third principle is that being aware of this doesn't make you the exception. It makes you more valuable to the people who actually deserve loyalty, because you stop wasting trust on people who are never going to earn it. This is the part that gets missed by people who hear trust is conditional and assume it means becoming guarded with everyone. The opposite is usually true. Once you stop extending blind trust automatically, you become far more capable of extending real trust, selectively, deliberately, to the people who've actually demonstrated they'll hold it under pressure. Machiavelli's realism about loyalty wasn't a rejection of connection. It was a filter that separated people worth real investment from people who were only ever going to take the free version. There's a harder truth underneath all of this that most people avoid looking at directly. You are also someone else's test. Every relationship you're in is quietly asking, at some point, what you'll do when loyalty to that person costs you something real. The people who understand this stop performing loyalty they haven't actually verified in themselves, because performed loyalty that hasn't been tested is exactly the cheap material Machiavelli warned against. just coming from the other direction. Real trustworthiness, like real trust, only means something once it's been priced against an actual cost. The final realization is this: every time you've been surprised by someone's betrayal, it wasn't usually because they changed, it was because you never actually knew what their loyalty was resting on in the first place. You assumed it was character, when it was circumstance, and circumstance changed. Machiavelli's coldness about loyalty was never really cynicism, it was precision. He wasn't telling princes to trust no one. He was telling them to know exactly what any given trust was built on before betting something they couldn't afford to lose on it. Holding. If this changed how you think about loyalty, trust, or what your relationships are actually built on, that's exactly the point. If you want to see what happens when someone discovers they were never actually respected the way they assumed, take care of yourself.